Welcome to Voices,
a podcast from the Institute for Human Rights and Business.
Here, we're seeking to elevate the range of perspectives
on the role of business in the world
and in people's everyday lives.
Hello, everyone. I'm Neil Wilkins from the Institute for Human Rights and Business. Welcome to this Voices podcast. Today, I am delighted to welcome author and activist Emily Kenway. Emily was involved with the establishment of the Office of the UK Anti-Slavery Commissioner, where she was responsible for private sector engagement. More recently, she has worked for a number of organisations focused on labour rights in both the UK and abroad. Her book, The Truth About Modern Slavery, was published earlier this year. In her book, as well as describing patterns of exploitation for workers, Emily also challenges some of the assumptions and frames of reference we use to describe and prevent modern slavery. Emily, welcome.
Thank you.
Emily, the phrase modern slavery has become a key part of the business and human rights lexicon, and one that we're all familiar with. We see civil society campaigning against it, business telling us that they have zero tolerance of it, and governments introducing legislation to tackle it. You, of course, were right in the middle of things as the UK Modern Slavery Act and the role of the Anti-Slavery Commissioner were established. Why do you think that modern slavery has become a defining issue for our time?
Well, thank you. It's a great question. And I think there's two parts to this answer. One is specific to the UK, which is that when you see when it was that modern slavery became kind of politically higher on the agenda, so in Westminster, Theresa May, then Home Secretary, taking a real interest in it, it is at exactly the same time as we were introducing very harmful and extreme immigration policies. So it was the kind of heyday of the hostile environment, that being a collection of laws and policies that seek to make life as unpleasant as possible for undocumented people in the UK. So you have Theresa May announcing in 2013 that we're going to have this modern slavery law in the same year that she sanctioned vans to drive around neighbourhoods telling people to go home if they're undocumented, and there being a big backlash against that. And you can really trace it through her speeches, as I do a bit in chapter 1 of the book, where you will see her essentially making pronouncements on migration that are really kind of strict and strong, and that are definitely designed to play to a more right-wing voter audience. And then she'll finish her speech touching on modern slavery, bringing in this kind of moral counterweight, we'll do the right thing, this kind of attitude. And then you see it exactly again with the actual pattern of laws. 2014, we have an immigration law bringing in more of this hostile environment. 2015, we have the Modern Slavery Act. 2016, again, we have more immigration law. So it's like really clearly used as a political strategy in that way. The second part is relevant to far wider jurisdictions than the UK alone, which is we've really seen over recent decades the rise of ideas about corporate social responsibility and corporate citizenship. In 2011, we have the Ruggie Principles, the UN Guiding Principles on Business Human Rights, and definitely in investing, ESG considerations have become more mainstreamed and stronger in investment houses. And modern slavery fits really neatly into that realm. And I say neatly because essentially what I argue in the book characterizes these ideas, CSR, corporate citizenship type ideas, is solutions that do not actually touch the business models at play. Solutions that may be well-meaning, and I'm not suggesting people working in those departments don't really want meaningful change. I know lots of them and I know that they do, but actually a lot of what's done is window dressing that doesn't attack the fundamental business models. And as I think we'll come on to in later questions, modern slavery is a really neat way of thinking about exploitation for keeping in that safe realm for businesses.
I understand. So people think that they know what modern slavery is, and they probably have visions, and it's presented as visions of perhaps chains and incarceration, or maybe linked in their minds with trafficking. But the basic premise of your book, The Truth About Modern Slavery, however, is that the reality of modern slavery is actually quite far removed from what we think it is. Perhaps you can sort of describe for us what you believe the reality to be, and why do you think that these misconceptions about the true nature of modern slavery are so dominant?
So I'm going to tell you about a particular case that I think really clearly demonstrates the failure to understand the types of labour circumstance we're now calling modern slavery. And I should say I've seen this with major corporations, this inherent misunderstanding. So they think they've done good work in their supply chains because they're looking for this very, very extreme thing, and they don't understand what the law actually says. So in a place called Manalada in Greece, 42 undocumented Bangladeshi workers were recruited there in 2012 and 2013 to pick strawberries. So they were brought there to do that, and they were deceived about their pay and hours. They were working 12-hour days under supervision of armed guards, and they weren't being paid. So this is a classic trafficking case, right? They were recruited and transported. They were deceived about the terms of employment, and then they were exploited. That's the three-part definition of trafficking. They were told they'd be paid if they carried on working, but they continued not to be paid, so they went on strike. But then their employers brought in some new migrant workers to kind of undercut them, and the original workers got really worried they were never going to be paid, so they physically started to move towards their employers to ask to be paid, and the armed guards opened fire on them. So this all erupted and went to court. The Greek court acquitted the employers of trafficking. Thankfully, the workers went to the European Court of Human Rights, which found that the Greek court had misunderstood what trafficking is. It had understood trafficking as slavery, as the kind of historical conception of slavery. And because strawberry picking is seasonal, and because the workers could leave the farm when they weren't working, the Greek court thought this can't possibly be trafficking, right? Because trafficking is slavery. But actually, that's not what trafficking is in the law. This is what an amazing professor called Janie Chuang calls slavery creep, right? Where we start to bring in those connotations and meanings to things that actually don't have to look that extreme in reality. That doesn't mean they're not problematic, of course. So businesses go looking for these crazy extreme solutions without really understanding what we're talking about. And they also don't understand that exploitation operates on a continuum. If you only look for the flashpoints, you're not dealing with the circumstances that gave rise to those flashpoints. Because if you have a supply chain which is not having proper enforcement of labour laws, with lots of workers who don't know their rights, don't know how to ensure their rights, you're going to have the extreme instances, but that's because you've got this bedrock of problems in the first place. So it's really a question of understanding that this is born of structural issues. This is born of kind of systems and models, not individual deviants, not individual very extreme cases that are like something from a Hollywood film.
I want to come back to that in a minute because I think it's really important. But your book, as well as describing the reality of exploitation, also sort of discusses this something far deeper, how this common framing that we give to modern slavery sort of fails to prevent exploitation and may even run counter to that. I think that that's what you were just talking about, the myths that we live by around that. Could you just explain that a little more?
Yeah, so I draw on the work of a cognitive linguist called George Lakoff in the book, who has done a lot of work on this idea called framing, which is essentially that when we use particular words or phrases, we're constructing a kind of frame in our minds. We're tapping into a whole load of inferences, connotations, and meanings about an issue that tells us about how we should understand that issue, right? Who is to blame for it? What are the range of solutions for it? So when we're thinking about modern slavery, it's really helpful to understand modern slavery is a particular kind of story. It's a narrative about exploitation, right? And then to say, well, what is that story telling us about who's to blame, what we could do about it? And crucially, who is benefiting from that particular story about exploitation? There are particular characteristics of it that I explain in the book, which are that basically it's described as a kind of criminal or humanitarian issue rather than a political issue or an economic issue. So you literally find in speeches and documents people saying this is not a political issue, this is above party politics. Of course, party politics is about opinions on distribution of power, which inherently is what we're talking about with exploitation. And that's why you get so many descriptions of modern slavery as being a kind of parasite or a virus, these kind of ideas that it's like a contaminant that we just need to wipe away from the general political economy and everything will be fine. So this makes us think in the kind of simple fairy tale narrative way about exploitation. It makes us identify the problem as an individual causing this harm, your rotten apple, and not look at the barrel. So we blame the individual who moves an undocumented migrant rather than a hostile environment policy that means there was no legal pathway for them to move. Or we blame the employer of a domestic worker who keeps them in domestic servitude, but we don't talk about the visa conditions that tied the worker to that employer. Or we blame a subcontracted factory manager who's using forced labor instead of the purchasing practices of companies that drive down the costs, require crazy turnaround times, and so on. And I do say in the book, it's a really comforting fairy tale. It sounds like a strange thing to say about something horrible, but it's comforting because it's really simplistic. It's like a superhero film, right? Let's find the baddie, lock them up, great. Let's raid and rescue, and we can all carry on fine. And actually, the problem is much deeper and requires much bigger change and actual change, not window dressing.
So we're encouraged to see modern slavery as this exceptional phenomenon and something separate from general conditions, labour conditions for workers. So how do you think that this impacts on possible solutions?
It impacts on them hugely and massively affects and curtails our kind of view, our field of view of what the solutions are and which ones we select. And I think that's very convenient. That could, without sounding like a conspiracy theorist, I think that's why this is such a popular narrative in many ways. Because it means we're not looking at solutions that actually challenge power imbalances and business models and so on. So if you think it's a rotten apple problem, then awareness raising is something that makes a lot of sense, right? Raise people's awareness that there might be a rotten apple over there. But what if their only option available is that rotten apple? That's the only work option available. This is something that we see in lots of really interesting research that's only been in recent years. In UK hand car washes, for example, people who are being technically exploited will often not want to be rescued, so to speak, because they don't have a better employment opportunity. And there's some great research I talk about in the book from Nigeria about child domestic workers and the fact that there are no other economic opportunities. For supply chains, I think this is where audits come in. Audits make so much sense if you don't really understand modern slavery. If you think it's a really extreme occasional thing, then of course send in someone you consider an expert to spot that issue and extricate it. But I mean, aside from the fact you obviously have no idea what's going to be going on the week after that person's not there anymore, consider what that says about power and where you think power and knowledge lies. In an auditing circumstance, the employer has the power, right? They're like the superhero who can send in the auditor. That's the person with the knowledge. And they check the workers as if the workers are a kind of like liquid substance that don't have anything to say themselves. What if the workers are part of the solution? I've been in so many meetings with brands where they're talking about, in a kind of really mystified way, how can we find out what the working conditions are in our supply chains and on the factory floors? And there's a really well-known way of doing that, and it's called trade unions, but that's not considered part of this narrative because trade unions are understood as being about general labor rights. And the modern slavery narrative exceptionalizes modern slavery, exceptionalizes exploitation as something separate. If you understand that the worst offences that fall under the Modern Slavery Act do not occur in a vacuum, but instead, as a special rapporteur from the UN on human trafficking has very clearly said, they occur when you have endemic labour abuses, then you realise why unions make a lot of sense, because they are a continual front line of defence against any kinds of violations in workplaces. I think it's absolutely crucial to rethink the way we're understanding the problem if we want to choose the right solutions.
And then ultimately there needs to be a response to that from business and government. So what would an appropriate response be, do you think?
Well, I think one of the things has to be a consideration of how this is being talked about. So it's kind of, I think it's really interesting about this space that, like, in a similar way to my previous answer, we get these sort of mystified conversations about, well, what can business and the government do about modern slavery, as if it's this this sort of unicorn issue that's come out of nowhere. Well, what can the government and business do about poor working conditions and endemic poverty? You know, that's a question we've all had before for a long time. I believe Charles Dickens wrote a lot about those issues in his books, you know. So we've kind of like created this weird new category that's not new at all. And really, we know the conversations we need to be having, we're just not having them. I'd really like to see structural interventions. So rather than more laws which introduce companies having to write pieces of paper about what they're doing, I'd like to see things like limiting supply chain tiers in high-risk sectors. That does exist in some jurisdictions in the world. Limits on outsourcing, enforcing labour laws properly, adopting responsible purchasing practices as a mandatory thing. I think fundamentally we need to get to a place where you shouldn't be in business if your business model is premised on these kinds of problems, which obviously a lot of business models are. Now, that is a massive ask, right? These are massive changes. I am not in the school of things being impossible, because what we have now was created by people and we can choose to do something different. That requires us to overcome ego. That requires us not to be afraid of going in a different direction. It requires courage. And it requires us to stop having kind of shiny reports and patting ourselves on the back about what we're doing well, when actually we're not really doing that well at all.
Emily, thank you very much. Very sobering reflections, but it's really refreshing to hear a unique perspective on something that a lot of people seem to talk about, but we don't seem to be any further forward with addressing. And I think that these are some of the issues that really do come out in your book. So thank you for your time today. It's been a really interesting discussion. Thank you, Emily. Emily's book, The Truth About Modern Slavery, is available for download online or from good booksellers. It's produced by Pluto Press. It's very readable and is highly recommended for anyone seeking to see beyond some of the usual assumptions that we make about this subject. Thank you for listening to this Voices podcast from the IHRB. Please do subscribe to our newsletter to hear all the latest information from the Institute and the world of business and human rights. Thank you.